I am proposing to do away with the current federal income tax system. For all of recorded history, governments of the few have ruled over and oppressed the many. These societies developed from ethical systems which held that people are not equal. All the great societies of history have been societies in which the rulers have enjoyed special rights and privileges over the masses. Even in the ancient Greek republics, only about 20% of the people were actually citizens, while the majority had no say in the government. America, however, was founded on a different set of principles. A set of principles which turned the world of government upside down. The Declaration of Independence declares these principles as such: that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted amongst men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive to these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it, and institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles, and organizing its powers in what way seems best to protect their safety and happiness. End quote. The Americans won their freedom and established their government on these foundational principles. These principles have never been rescinded by the people. However, in the early 1900s, Americans were talked into allowing their Congress to tax people's incomes, an act which is not in line with those foundational principles, and has since actually led those in government to act contrary to the principles upon which the United States is founded. Because of the unprincipled manner by which we are taxed, those running the federal government have been able to use the illegitimately obtained money to press antithetical social agendas upon the people of the individual states and violate the rights of the people they are supposed to be protecting. I am proposing a new federal tax system which will address these issues and put us back on track with the principles of just government so that we can once again, as America, be a just and prosperous nation. This nation came into existence because a generation of Americans elected to live by a code of ethics that held that life is not so dear and peace is not so sweet if it is to be, quote, purchased at the price of chains and slavery, end quote. They were willing to die to get rid of a government that believed itself to be above the law. Now, taxation without representation was one of the most important cries of the colonists, motivating them to the Revolutionary War. And taxes such as the Intolerable Acts, one of which being the tea tax which prompted the Boston Tea Party, were seen as unjust on their surface. For the Americans believed that if they were to receive no official substantive representation in Parliament, through which these taxes were invented and by which the funds from such taxes would be spent, then they were not ethically bound to pay for what they had no say in establishing. The Founding Fathers realized that the Crown government was not going to change from its unjust ways. So as representatives of the colonies, they wrote out what they believed to be the principles of just government, as not set by them or by some vote of men, but as established by nature's God. They also brought up a list of actions by the Crown government detailing its considerable and several violations of those principles. And they concluded from those violations that, quote, these united colonies are and of right ought to be free and independent states, end quote. They published that document for the world to see, the document which most Americans recognize as the birth certificate of the United States, the Declaration of Independence. The authors realized that authority does not reside first and foremost in a person, such as a king or even the government, but that supreme authority resides with God. And it is by God giving the power of certain inalienable rights to the individual, and only from there, from the just consent of the individual to the government, can the government obtain any just authority at all. The authors also recognize that the only just purpose of government is to protect the individual's rights. The Americans gained the freedom to set for themselves new forms of government, and based on the principles of just government declared in the Declaration of Independence, including eventually the framing of a federal government by the ratification of the Constitution, Within this framework, the Constitution ensures equal representation to the states in the Senate and equal representation to the people through the various congressional districts of the House of Representatives. With this formula, the states represented as sovereign entities in the Senate have half of the legislative power, and the people, represented as sovereign entities in the House of Representatives, have the other half of the legislative power, including the power to tax and spend. In this way, because of the equal representation in the Senate, the larger populated states could not, by their overwhelming population, override the rights of the smaller states. And yet, in the House of Representatives, with the people being represented equally, the smaller states could not hold their will over the greater will of the majority of the people of the larger populated states. The people also consented to Congress a limited power of taxation, that the Congress could not directly tax the individual, but had to look to the states for funding, and that taxes had to be called for through an apportionment directed to the state governments. Now, for most of America's first 150 years, import and export duties provided sufficient funds for the constitutionally limited activities and responsibilities of the government. However, in the early 1900s, as several laws which work against the ethic of the principles of just government were passed by the federal government. Among these is the current federal income tax system. Since the enactment of the 16th Amendment, the federal government has acted to directly tax the people, while the people have received no reciprocal direct say in determining the tax. This power imbalance denies the principles of just government upon which the United States is founded and oversteps the power boundaries originally put in place by the founders to ensure that the power to tax and the burden of who would be responsible for paying the taxes passed by Congress would reflect the representative strength of those same parties in the legislative branch and allow the states to be the check on that power. The current federal income tax system is antithetical to the principles of just government and screams taxation without representation. If the principles of just government are truly self-evident, as the Declaration of Independence suggests, then Americans ought to look at their federal tax system in light of those principles, wherein they would no doubt realize that we need to throw off the tyranny of the present federal income tax system and replace it with the system that actually follows the principles of just government, principles which the colonists gave their lives to defend and which this generation needs to protect so as to hand their posterity the same blessings that their forefathers handed them. The current federal tax system needs to be reformed so as to follow the principles of just government. I propose it be reformed as follows. 1. The Congress must finalize a budget at the beginning of each fiscal year by a specific date. Congress cannot later go back and change it once it has finalized the budget. And also, if Congress fails to finalize the budget by that specific date, then a 10% across-the-board cut shall happen for all federal departments from the previous year's budget. This particular idea was originally presented by Mark Levin in his book, The Liberty Amendments. 2. The Senate and the House of Representatives have equal legislative power in determining the budget and the tax burden. Because of this, I propose that the Senate be responsible for half of the federal budget, and the House of Representatives be responsible for the other half of the federal budget. 3. Since each state within the Senate has equal representation, equal power, and equal vote within the Senate, and there being 50 states, I propose that each state be responsible for 1/50th of the Senate's half of the budget. Likewise, for number 4, each district within the House of Representatives has equal representation, equal power, and equal vote within the House. And since there are 435 districts represented in the House, I suggest that each district be responsible for 1/435th of the House's half of the budget. 5. The states shall be responsible for collecting the taxes, but the states are free to collect the taxes within their state however they see fit, as long as each district is burdened equally and in the same manner. 6. If a state fails to pay its apportionment, then it is liable to lose its vote in the Senate until it pays its apportionment in full. But it will not lose the vote in the House of Representatives. However, if a district fails to pay its apportionment, it is the state that is still liable to lose its vote in the Senate because it is the state that is responsible for collecting the taxes. 7. There shall be no withholding of taxes allowed, for this psychologically hides the cost of the tax system from the individual and neutralizes the possibility for the citizen to demand a more just system. This plan places greater responsibility upon those in Congress to consider the cost that their vote shall have upon their constituents. For each person in Congress shall now be politically much closer to the people they represent and much more fairly representative of the people in the state insofar as the tax burden is concerned. This plan also directs political power back to the states and coincides with what the Declaration of Independence claims to be the principles of just government. With this system, the people of the several states are free to tax themselves in what way they think is most just and best for their particular state-based economic situation. The states are free to determine if they want a sales tax, flat tax, or any other kind of tax, as long as within their state, as long as each state pays its apportionment. Perhaps best of all, under this system, the federal government has no direct hand over the individual, but only over the state insofar as the tax system is concerned. This thereby places the checks and balances of power between the federal government and the state governments back in its proper principled order, which were originally put in place to preserve freedom and justice for the individual. This further benefits the individual because if he does not think that a state is taxing him fairly, then he can move to another state with a better tax system in his eyes, or he can organize others within his own district to lawfully protest and change the system. Under the present system, there is practically no manner by which the individual citizen can fight the Internal Revenue Service on anything. A state, however, has much more political clout and power to do so. Additionally, this allows for the regional differences in the character of the people of the United States to breathe a bit more freely. If, for example, the people of one state think it fair to live under a welfare state, then they can do so through a much more local and much more likely to be successful state government. While people in states where the general worldview does not hold that wealth redistribution by the government is a principle of just government, then they no longer have to suffer under such a system. A current example of this can be seen between California and Texas. Quote, California used to be the dream destination of millions of people, but now many are fleeing the Golden State, and much of it has to do with high taxes and a generally anti-business attitude, end quote. Paul Strand's article continues on to explain that many wealthy people and businesses are fleeing overbearing taxes in California and are relocating to states such as Texas with better tax systems. Now, Section 5 of my proposals serves to give the power and responsibility back to the states and serves to protect the individual from the hand of the federal government from which he presently has no true protection. Under this reformed tax system, there shall be no direct taxes allowed upon the individual citizen from the federal government. Now, taxes do not have to be seen by people as a necessary evil. But if they were justly apportioned and justly spent on justly consented activities of the federal government, then people would not see them as anything but the natural cost of having their rights and liberties protected. It is when the government oversteps its consented authority or acts in other unjust, unprincipled ways that taxes become seen as burdensome and evil. Now, there is no reason for a nation of people founded on a set of principles to think that they have to tolerate any injustice from the officials in government, such as with the present federal income tax system. According to Jeffrey Jones, only about half of all Americans believe their taxes are fair. Now, this may not seem too concerning to some, but when one also considers that 47% of Americans pay no federal income taxes, it suggests that the people actually paying the taxes find their burden to be unjust. And when most of the people actually paying the taxes find themselves unjustly burdened by the tax system, it is long overdue that a more just system be established. Now, it is up to us, the citizens of the United States, to throw off the tyranny and immorality of the present federal income tax system and replace it with this system, based on the principles of just government. A system which will help cause the Congress to actually operate so as to protect our rights, rather than one which makes the individual pay the cost for others to violate their rights. In the 1828 Webster's Dictionary, after the entry for citizen, it warns, quote, "If the people of the United States should not be free and happy, the fault will be entirely their own," end quote. It is this generation's turn to decide if we will take up the torch and run with it. So in the words of Lincoln, quote, "that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth," end quote. Now I suggest that we, the people, take up that torch together. Thank you.